Hi, and welcome to Lecture 6. Part 1 of this lecture will focus on technical definitions and on Project 7, and Part 2 will focus on email format. Here's a definition of technical definitions, and the main thing to be aware of here is that what we're talking about is defining specialized terms for a general audience. So thinking of it almost like translating concepts. That doesn't mean that we don't sometimes have to define terms for other specialists, but in this case we're specifically talking about defining terms for non-experts, which means that we're using a general vocabulary, not a specialist vocabulary. So why do we need technical definitions? In general, anytime we can make our writing more specific, it's a good thing, and that's one thing that definitions do. It clarifies what we're talking about. It helps to make our writing more usable for our audience because they understand what we mean. And definitions can have broader legal, ethical, and societal implications. They can help the general public to understand and evaluate important technical, political, and social issues. Another thing to bear in mind about definitions here and about writing with specificity and clarity is that we are legally responsible for what we write, so it is important to convey information accurately, both the facts that we may be conveying in a definition and any interpretations that we may be conveying in a definition. Now there are three broad levels of detail that we might use in a definition that the class discusses, and how much information we need to provide is going to depend on our situation and especially on what the audience needs to know and what information they're bringing with them. The three levels of definition we're going to discuss are the parenthetical, the sentence, and the expanded. So the parenthetical definition is the shortest. Usually it's offering a synonym, a single word or very short phrase that will clarify the meaning of a technical word. Another word for a parenthetical definition is a gloss. And the good thing about parenthetical definitions is that once you take the time to create one, you can then use the technical term in the future. You've sort of made it legal to use. And an example of a parenthetical definition is illustrated in this sentence here. The trees are mostly deciduous, leaf-bearing. So the parenthetical definition is that phrase, leaf-bearing. We're using it as a gloss for the technical term deciduous. And it works pretty well to do this because it's a short term that has a synonym that can be easily encapsulated. However, not every concept is simple enough that it can be defined with a single word or short phrase. So hence the next level of definition, the sentence definition, which as the name suggests means that our definitions will be the length of a single sentence. They conclude sort of three components. The first component of the sentence definition is the name of the thing we're defining. The second component is the class or category that the thing we're defining belongs to. The third component are whatever features would differentiate the thing we're defining from other things in the same class or category. And all of this is put together in a single coherent sentence. And I do want to stress that it should be written as a single grammatical sentence. The textbook discusses sentence definitions on pages 398 and 399. And on page 398 they show a chart, and they're using a chart because they're trying to explain the three different parts of the definition. Unfortunately, sometimes students see that and they think that means that's how they're supposed to create definitions. They're supposed to put them in a chart. No, don't put them in a chart, write sentences. Here's an example. Stress. Now this is the word we're defining. It's part 1 of our definition. Here's part 2, the category or class that stress belongs to. Now there's more than one kind of stress, right? This stress is an applied force. We're talking about something in physics or engineering, perhaps. But I might be feeling some stress because I have too much work I haven't gotten done. that's an emotional feeling. So that's a different class or category. And third, the thing that will differentiate stress in this case from other kinds of applied forces, from other things in the same class or category. So here we see that stress is an applied force that strains or deforms an object. Not every applied force will strain or deform an object, so that distinguishes stress from other kinds of applied forces. Now I've used sort of 3 little blocks here to help present this information sequentially, but again, this is a single complete sentence. Stress is an applied force that strains or deforms an object. And when you write your definitions for project 7, I want you to be writing coherent sentence definitions. And if you were in class with me, we'd be practicing that right now. As a group, we would be working together to define some terms. So for example, if I asked you to define PowerPoint, the first thing you'd want to do, of course, is have that at the beginning of the sentence, PowerPoint is, but then you'd think about what class or category it belonged to. And there's a couple of different paths you could take, but most people usually say it's software, which it is. And ideally, if we can narrow that class or category a little bit, that will help us even further with our definition. So instead of just classifying it as software, how about we call it presentation software? So we've given ourselves a narrower category. Now we need to distinguish PowerPoint from other kinds of presentation software, such as, say, Prezi. What would distinguish it? Well, primarily that it's published by Microsoft. So now our definition of PowerPoint becomes PowerPoint is presentation software published by Microsoft. Now that's not the only way we could define it. In fact, we could switch elements of the categories. We could have defined PowerPoint as Microsoft software that is used for making visual presentations. In that case, we've made our class or category Microsoft software. We need to then distinguish it from Microsoft Word or Microsoft Excel, so we do that by explaining that it's used for visual presentations. So sometimes we have those kinds of choices about what is the class and what are the features that differentiate it from other items in the class. Sometimes there are fewer choices, there's fewer ways to define things. It will depend on what you're defining. At this point, I'd like to point you to a definitions exercise that you can find in the handouts folder here in Blackboard Learn. This is a little exercise where you're given some sentence definitions that have problems. Sometimes the problem is that the item is not correctly classified or categorized, or maybe it's completely lacking a class or category. Sometimes the problem is in differentiating it from other things in the class. So there's a list of terms that have a problem. On this exercise, the first thing you're supposed to do is sort of figure out what's not working, and then you're supposed to rewrite the definition to make it work. So if you choose to use this definitions exercise to practice, or if you choose to read through it to understand the concept, both the questions and the answers are offered in this exercise. After you've had a chance to look at that, if you have questions about sentence definitions, please post to the questions forum. It's important to understand this because this is what we're going to be doing in our next assignment. An expanded definition is sort of the next level up the food chain. It's longer, it's going to be more than one sentence. It could even be as long as a whole book. Basically, some concepts are very difficult, and so they need more information to make them comprehensible. There's different ways we might expand a definition, and which you choose will depend on what you're trying to define, what your audience already knows about it, what they need to know, what they're going to do with this information, what just concept it is, what kinds of things will help explain it best. You, for Project 7, will only be writing single sentences, so these expansion methods won't be particularly relevant for you in this assignment, with possibly the exception of examples. Sometimes you're able to squeeze a brief example into a sentence definition, and that can often be helpful. What makes a definition usable? Well, there's some criteria in the textbook you can look at. First of all, your definition is usable if it's got the right level of detail for what the audience needs to do. Your definition needs to classify the item you're defining precisely and correctly. That's often something we have a hard time with. We know what something means because we use the word all the time. So to slow down and think about exactly what it means is a little bit trickier. Similarly, you need to differentiate the item accurately from other things in that same category. And again, this might be something that's hard because the meaning of the term is more transparent to us. It's highly important to be accurate. As I said before, you are liable if you have inaccurate definitions. You also want to avoid circular definitions, which is when you don't actually define the thing, you just kind of keep repeating the terms. So like a work stoppage is when someone stops working. You don't introduce any outside information to make things more clear. If it's helpful, you might want to expand your definition. That will add usability. Visuals can be great in some instances. Doesn't really apply for us in Project 7, but very often a single picture will do so much more than even a lengthy explanation. Placing your definition in an effective location is vital for usability, and generally speaking, you want to place a definition close to where you've introduced the term that needs to be defined. Now for us in Project 7, you're essentially creating a glossary, so you've already got a specific structure in which to work. But if you're creating a different kind of document, you'll have to decide, will it be better to have a glossary at the end that the reader can turn to? Will it be better to define the terms as I go? If these are short definitions, if they're parenthetical, that may work well, but if the reader has to stop a lot to read long definitions, that may be less effective. Would a sidebar work? So depending on the kind of document you're creating and the way it's going to be used, you'll make some different choices in this regard. And finally, you need to be careful to be legal and ethical in your creation of definitions. Your communication will be unethical if it leaves the recipient of the communication at a disadvantage. So you want to be giving people the best information. Will people make bad decisions with good information? Absolutely, they're human beings. But you want to have a level playing field, and you want to not disadvantage anyone from the start. You need to make sure that your writing is completely accurate, completely honest, and completely fair. So no matter how you feel about something, don't interject biased wording, and definitely don't interject inaccuracies. If you deliberately put inaccuracies in your writing and try to deceive someone, you can get in big trouble legally. But most of the time, that's not the problem. Most of us aren't trying to defraud someone or make false claims, but we make mistakes. We slip up here and there unintentionally. Nonetheless, even if your misinformation is given unintentionally, just because you didn't know better, you can still be legally liable, especially if someone makes a bad decision or is hurt by your misinformation. Plagiarism is something we're usually familiar with in an academic setting, and it's typically an ethical issue rather than a legal issue. But essentially, plagiarism is any time you present someone else's words, ideas, images, sounds, thoughts as if they were your own. Even if you're unintentional about plagiarizing, it's an ethical problem. Sometimes students think, well, I didn't just download this off the internet to try to fool someone. I'm not plagiarizing. I just forgot to put the citation. No, even if you intended to give credit and you just forgot, it is an ethical problem. Now, copyright infringement's a different matter. Copyright infringement is a legal problem. Usually we don't see that in the academic setting, and it doesn't occur in the workplace setting terribly often, although it can occur. Even plagiarism, even though it's not a legal issue, if you are seen to have plagiarized in the workplace setting, it can be very damaging. People can lose their reputations or their jobs sometime because they have presented information as if they created it, and it comes out later that someone else actually created that first. So how do you avoid plagiarism? Well, first off, use your own words and ideas. And if for any reason you do need to use a source information, sometimes you do, because sometimes you're doing research, make sure you give credit to the sources you use. Now later in the semester we'll talk more about how to avoid plagiarism through citation when we're preparing for the proposal. Most of us have had this concept at least introduced in our freshman composition classes, if not elsewhere. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Project 7. It is important that you read the Project 7 instructions first because I can't really discuss it completely fully in this slideshow. What I'm looking for in Project 7 is essentially an email document, not one that you will actually email me. It will be a word process document that is formatted as if it were an email and is going to be defining some terms. The assignment for Project 7 lists certain scenarios. There's a default scenario at the beginning that involves some basic computer terminology. And the situation is you're imagining you are defining some basic computer terminology for an elderly lady who's getting her first computer system. You are given the terms and you simply have to define each of them in a list of, basically in a glossary, So I will say most of the class will probably choose that because it's sort of basic and we all are pretty familiar with those terms. However, there are some other options. There are other scenarios that are relevant to different occupational backgrounds, such as a construction-based scenario or a logistics-based scenario or one about local area networks. You can pick one of those scenarios if you wish. Just make sure that you truly do understand all the terminology in the scenario. So it's not enough to say, hey, I'm going to be, a construction management major, so I'll go ahead and pick this one, but then you don't really know what it's talking about because maybe you haven't gotten to that point in your studies yet. So only pick one of the other scenarios if you feel comfortable doing it and you truly do understand the terms. Now they're set up a little differently. In those cases, the terms are not listed for you. You have to read the scenario and they each sort of explain the situation, but basically you're a specialist and you're going to convey some information to someone who is not a specialist about your field. And the scenario explains things using technical terms. Your first job is to identify the technical terms from the scenario, list them out, and define them. Do not rewrite the scenario. That is not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to look at the scenario and just identify the words in the scenario that would be hard for someone to understand if they weren't a specialist, and just define those words. There's a sample for both of these assignments. Both if you have chosen the default, there's a sample in the sample documents folder of someone defining the computer terms, and then there's a sample of someone taking one of the other scenarios and how they've chosen and listed and defined the terms for one of those other scenarios. If you're not sure, if you choose one of the other scenarios, if you're not sure which terms you are going to be defining, you're welcome to try to identify them and then post to the questions forum and ask, hey, Ms. Piercy, here are the terms I think I should be defining for this. What do you think? And I'll be glad to tell you as long as you post it to the questions forum where everyone in the class can read it. Okay? So I'm not going to tell you how to define them, but I'll tell you if you ask whether you're right or wrong about which words you need to define and what you might be missing. Okay, what am I looking for in Project 7? Correct email format. We're going to talk about that in the second video. Your document being logically organized and showing good document design. So logical organization might mean that you list the terms in order of how the person needs to understand the terms, maybe listing fundamental concepts first and then building on those to define more complex concepts. Some people will use an alphabetical organization. That's not always best in this case. Sometimes it can work quite well. We're all familiar with alphabetical glossaries, but it doesn't allow you typically to build on those fundamental concepts and reuse those words then in subsequent definitions. So think about what's going to fit your list of terms best. Make sure you're using design features to make your document readable and clear. All the appropriate words in the assignment should be defined, and they should be defined each in a single sentence using this three-part sentence style format. Do not write lengthy explanations. One sentence per term. Make sure all the language is general audience language. Don't use specialized terminology unless you define it first. And of course, you're going to need to show good writing. good grammar, good mechanics, all the things that we've talked about in this class so far. A few other tips. Make sure only one sentence per concept. List these terms and definitions. Do not try to write a little mini essay. Make sure all your information is accurate. If you have to look up information to avoid inaccuracy, then do so. Generally speaking, I prefer that you don't look up too many terms, but it would be better to look up terms than to give out bad information. If you don't know what the difference between the web and the internet is, look it up. As I said, you don't use outside sources unless you need to avoid giving out misinformation. And any outside sources that you use, please put them into your own words and make sure to cite your source using some citation format. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about Project 7. If you've got questions about it after looking at the samples in the sample documents folder, please post to the questions forum. Part 2 of this video slideshow will be about email.